A girl named Naomi was unique in a small town once. She had a large dark scar on her face that ran from her forehead to her cheek, which she covered with an eye patch. The scar was caused by an accident when she was young, and no one liked to discuss her father. He was a strong man with oil-stained hands who always told her that her beauty lay in her heart rather than her face. He worked hard as a panel beater, mending broken cars so that Naomi could attend school, but no one seemed to care about her at school. Johnson was the school's golden boy, wealthy, well-liked, and constantly surrounded by people. His father owned the largest supermarket in town, had the best clothes, shoes, and everything. He was the loudest person in the room and the crest when it came to Naomi. The children laughed at her, pointed at her face, whispered behind her back, and said, "Look at her face." One girl giggled, "She looks like a broken pot," but the worst of all was Johnson. Johnson's need called her dirty, asking why she even came to school. One morning, as she leaned on the classroom door, he said, "You look like a monster." He asked, "Did your father fix your face the way he fixes old cars?" Her friends laughed, but she tried to ignore them, telling herself that she didn't care, but deep down she felt a stone pressing down on her heart. She walked past them, her scar burning beneath their cruel stares, but inside she was wearing a bra. When she arrived at her usual spot, she put her tray down without noticing the water on the chair she was sitting in. The cafeteria was bustling with conversation, and the air smelled of jollof rice and beans. Naomi gripped her tray tightly, her stomach growling. She had saved her lunch money all week to buy a special meal today, fried rice and chicken, but she didn't see the sneakers or the way Johnson and his friends were observing her. She had no idea what they had done. The entire cafeteria fell silent for a moment, but then, "Oh no," Johnson's voice echoed like a drum, and she peed herself. Her fingers dug into the table, and she could feel her heart pounding and her ears burning as the laughter crashed over her like waves in a storm. A girl pointed at her skirt, wetting herself like a baby while a boy slapped his knee. Perhaps she saw her own face in the mirror and became afraid, even those who didn't want to laugh. The cafeteria froze, the laughter stopped, some students whispered, a few nodded, and Johnson's grin faded as his face twisted in anger. Naomi swallowed hard, wanted to run, and wanted to disappear, but she didn't. Slowly, she stood, and the room fell silent again as they watched her like hungry lions. She turned to face Johnson, locking eyes with him, and her voice was steady. "I may be wet, but at least I'm not drowning in arrogance like you." The following week, something even worse happened. The rain had fallen all morning, the sky was gray, the ground was soft and wet with puddles of brown, thick mud, and Naomi held her books close as she walked. The air was cold, but she was burning from the laughter, the whispers, and Johnson's looks. Pain, but inside she was breaking, and he did not like that she talked back. Oh no, he did not like it at all. He wanted to break her completely. Naomi didn't respond because she knew better. She turned to walk the other way, but they blocked her. She looked down to see a puddle of thick, sticky mud lying behind her, dark as night and deep as shame. Johnson smiled and pushed her, causing her to fall headfirst into the mud. He wanted more, so he wanted her to break. He turned the corner and there they were, Johnson and his gang. "Where are you going, Big Naomi?" Johnson smirked and his friends laughed. Matches on the ground, his friends' howls, and their voices filled the sky like crows sing over something dead. Naomi sat up slowly, mud dripping from her hair, clothes, and face, and her heart pounded. Her breath came quickly, and tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to cry for them. She wiped her face, got up, and left. She didn't run, she didn't shake off the mud, and she didn't turn around, but as the sun started to set that evening, something small and significant cracked inside. She didn't want to leave the school building like this, so she hooked her knees, pressed her face against them, and let the tears fall. Soft footsteps came, and a soft voice said, "Why are you crying, my child?" Naomi sniffed, wiped her nose, and looked up to see that it was Mrs. Ella, the school cleaner. She was elderly, with silver hair, and her hands were raw from years of scrubbing, but her eyes were warm. Naomi hesitated, then she whispered that it was Johnson, who wouldn't stop bullying me, saying that my scar makes. Mrs. Ella Seso put down her mop, found a small jar in her bag, and pressed it into Amar's hands. Naomi scowled and traced the lid with her fingers, wondering if it was an ointment. Mrs. Ella smiled, but there was something odd in her eyes. "Rub this on your scar every night," she said softly, then leaned in closer, her voice like the wind before a storm. "When someone insults you again, just say thank you, they will face the consequences," she said. Naomi frowned, wondering what kind of advice it was to say, "Thank you, how would that stop Johnson?" She wanted to ask, but Mrs. Ella was already picking up her mop. Naomi looked at the jar in her hands, which smelled strangely of herbs, but she nodded, thinking that maybe this would help. She put it in her pocket and went home, her heart heavy with questions. "I'm tired of being laughed at, tired of the pain, tired of the scar that makes me unique." As she stared at the jar in her hands on a small wooden bed, the room was dark except for the moonlight peeking through the window. She unscrewed the lid and sniffed the strong, bitter smell of crushed leaves, which made her eyes water a little. Naomi wondered if this was real and if it would actually make a difference, but she had nothing to lose. Slowly, she dipped her finger into the ointment and applied it to her scar, feeling the coolness spread across her skin and tingled like tiny. She sighed, put the jar under her pillow, and lay down, knowing that tomorrow would be another battle. When Naomi arrived at school the following morning, she could already hear the whispers. She knew that Johnson would immediately open his mouth and lean against the classroom door, arms crossed, his friends waiting behind him, grinning. "Hey, Big Naomi, your face has melted off," but he sneered, "That scar makes you look like a witch." The laughter was prepared, the insults were waiting, but Naomi did not frown, she did not droop her head, she smiled, and she said, "Thank you." His skin wavered, but she shrugged, and she walked past him without a word of laughter. The whispers did not follow, and Johnson stood there, staring at her, his face perplexed by something about her calmness, his fingers twitching his chest. Felt tight, but he brushed it off and decided to deal with her later. When school started the following morning, however, something odd happened. At first, no one paid attention, possibly because he had overslept or was running late, but by break time, his friend began whispering, "Where's Johnson?" The teachers noticed that Johnson was always present, loud, and causing trouble, but today he was nowhere to be found. By day 2, students were asking if they had seen Johnson, if he was traveling, or if something had happened. The teacher had sent a note home, but there had been no response. By day 3, the principal was concerned and called a meeting and sent a staff member to check on Johnson at home. When they arrived, they were shocked to see that Johnson was bedridden, his body weak, and his voice completely gone. His parents were afraid that their once boasting son was now weak like a leaf in a Harmattan wind. He was unable to eat or even speak, and his once bright face was swollen, his lips dry and cracked like old firewood. His mother sobbed, and his father paced the room, saying, "This is not normal." They took Johnson to the best doctor in town, who examined his eyes, pressed his stomach, listened to his heartbeat, gave him an injection of medication, and even gave him special vitamins, but nothing changed. The doctor finally said, "This is beyond me," and rubbed his head before they took. The family did not stop. They went to a well-known Islamic cleric who recited holy verses over Johnson's body, tied charms around his wrist, and then told Johnson's parents to give to the poor because it would heal him. The pastor at the city's largest church put his hands on Johnson's forehead and said, "Be healed in the name of Jesus." The pastor clapped his hands and shouted louder, then poured anointing oil on Johnson's head, but Johnson remained in agony. They helped widows, provided food, clothing, and food for hungry children, but Johnson's condition worsened over the next few days. Eventually, someone told them about a powerful herbalist in a deep village, and they drove for hours with Johnson in a car, his body burning with fever. The herbalist was an elderly man with dark eyes and gray hair who made black potions, mixed bitter herbs, and bathed Johnson in cold moonlight. Nothing changed, the herbalist sighed, saying, "This is beyond me." When Johnson's parents returned home, his mother wept day and night and his father sat in silence staring at nothing. Finally, one day, the sun was low in the sky and the air was thick and heavy, as if something was waiting to happen. Johnson's mother had not slept, her eyes were red, her body was exhausted, but she was unable to rest when her son lay in bed with his face swollen. Johnson's mother did not care about any of it. She stopped at a stall selling dried roots and bitter leaves, picked some, paid the woman, and turned to leave when she noticed an elderly woman with thin wrinkled clothing. She had tried everything, medicine, prayers, herbs, and nothing worked. Perhaps the herbal market had something stronger, she thought. She grabbed her basket and hurried to the market, which was bustling with vendors shouting, children running, goats chewing on leaves. She sat on the ground in ripped clothes, her hands outstretched, her voice soft and nearly drowned out the commotion, "Please, just a little food." Something tugged at Johnson's mother's heart, so she reached into her purse, took out some cash, and put it in the woman's hand. The old woman grabbed her wrist, colder than she had anticipated, and Johnson's mother gasped, "What are you doing?" The woman's dark, knowing eyes stared into hers, and then whispered, "Your son's illness is not natural." Mother spine, "What do you mean?" The old woman's eyes were sharp, and she knew that he had offended a very powerful girl. She told him that unless she forgives him, he will never be well. Johnson's mother's heart stopped, and she breathed. Who did he offend? The old woman shook her head, and her hands were shaking. She wanted to ask more, but when she blinked, the woman was gone, so she ran home and told Johnson's father. He stood motionless for a long time, and his parents searched frantically to find out who he had wronged and which child he had hurt so severely that even the strongest medication could not heal him. Johnson's mother muttered, "How do we know which one?" And Johnson's father went to the school, storming into the principal's office with a worried expression on his face. "Please, sir," he begged, "my son is sick, and we were informed that he offended someone, and unless that person forgives him, he won't be well. Do you know who it might be?" The principal sighed, removed his glasses, and rubbed his eyes. "Johnson has bullied many students," he said, but Johnson's father leaned forward, and his face was serious. Ma, the girl with the scar, was frozen in Naomi, and his mother whispered, "Yes, the principal said that he has made her life miserable, but maybe there is more to it now." The road to Naomi's house was rough at the time, but Johnson's parents did not notice the bumps. Instead, their hearts pounded too loudly, and fear sat in their chests like a heavy rock. Their son was lying in bed, weak, swollen, and helpless, and now they had the answer, Naomi. The girl with the scar was the girl their son had tormented, and the girl's pain had followed him home. They hurried into Amar's compound, where Amar's father was in his workshop, a spanner in one hand, grease on his shirt, and he was repairing a car with the hood open. Johnson was shocked to see how breathless and desperate his parents were. He wiped his face with a filthy cloth and looked up at them. "What brought you here?" Johnson's mother went to her knees and pleaded, "Please, sir. Our son is sick and he cannot walk or talk. We were told he offended someone and must be forgiven." The principal said, "It's your daughter." Her voice shook her hands, and she had never begged before, but today she knelt before a panel beater, her eyes full of tears. Naomi took a deep breath, thinking, "I didn't do anything to him. I don't know what you're talking about." Her father sighed, then walked to her slowly, put his hands on her shoulders, and looked into her eyes. "Will you forgive him?" she asked, standing at the doorway, arms crossed, shoulders stiff, her heart torn. This was the boy who had called her a monster, laughed at her pain, and shoved her into the M. Now he lay in bed helpless. "Even your worst enemy deserves to suffer like this." His voice was gentle like the wind whispering before the rain, "So please forgive him." Naomi looked at her father, the man who had taught her kindness even in the cruel world, and she looked at Johnson's parents, who had once believed their son was untouchable but were now on their knees. She exhaled slowly before speaking, "I will forgive him, but on one condition." Johnson's father grabbed her hands, but nothing in Naomi's voice shook Johnson. Johnson's mother reached for his hand and said, "We'll pay for your school until you finish university." Naomi hesitated, then nodded, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I forgive you, Johnson." That night, Johnson lay in bed, weak and helpless, while his parents watched over him, praying and hoping for the best. The house was quiet, the air was heavy, and as the first rays of dawn touched the sky, Johnson's parents nodded quickly. He must leave the school and never bully anyone again. Johnson William opened his eyes, and his mother gasped. His father hurried to his side, and after he licked his parched lips and swallowed, his mother started crying. His father then grabbed his hands and said, "You are healed." His voice had returned, and his strength gradually returned. By the second day, he was able to sit up, walk, and eat, and by the third day, he was able to eat. By the fourth day, it seemed as though he had never been ill. His parents wasted no time in removing him from school, and "You will never return." He never bullied anyone again at school because, as his father had said, "You will never hurt another person again." People whispered about her, but not about her scar. Instead, they whispered about her, their faces filled with a new respect. No one laughed at her anymore, and no one pointed fingers. Naomi was no longer just a girl with a scar, she was a girl with power, not just in school but throughout the entire town. I hope you found the story entertaining. If so, please like the video, comment on what you learned from it, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more enchanted tales like this one. She was once the girl that others laughed at, but now she was the girl who no one dared to look down on.